Sienna God, hello everyone. This is Kara Cowan Watts with Cherokee 411, and we're back with UKB's Tori Holland. Excited to see her again. She's already taken time to introduce herself in an earlier video, so we're going to focus on today's topic, which she's going to take her time. She's an expert in jurisdictional decision making. I know, and I talked to Cherokees out in the community, my own family, folks on the street. We're confused post McGirt. We absolutely support McGirt. We support the sovereignty of our tribes and the jurisdictions, and that we retained our right to govern ourselves. But when it comes down to criminals, victims, all these things, I think there gets confusion. So we're going to dive right in. Tori, introduce whatever you want, talk to us, share your screen, and we want to understand what happens when we are speeding, if somebody breaks into our house, murders, whatever this is, we want to know. Okay. Thank you, Tori, for being here today.
No problem. Thanks for having me. So I've been a prosecutor for several different tribes. My first prosecutor job was with Comanche Nation when they started their court. And my dad worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs my whole life. So in law school, dinner conversation was, let's say someone shoots a gun in the reservation and kills someone on state land. Who has jurisdiction to prosecute? So this is something I've grown up with, and law school really opened my eyes to how not complex this can be. So let's start with the basics. The first question is it Indian country? And Indian country is found in 18 USC 1151. And there's three kinds of Indian country. So the first is a reservation. The second is dependent Indian community. And then the third is restricted allotments. So for Oklahoma purposes, we always operated under prong C, which is the allotment, or trust land, which is a reservation. But then when McGirt happened and they found that basically half of Oklahoma was reservation, then we now fell under prong A, which is reservation. So that's your first question is it Indian country? And if it is Indian country, then your next question is, well, who's the perpetrator? Who's the person who did the crime? So this is where we start getting into the different categories. So there's 4 categories, and I'm going to share my screen hopefully with you. Haven't done that, so we'll see how it works. And it's Indian on Indian crime, Indian on non-Indian crime, non-Indian on Indian, and then non-Indian, non-Indian. But before we get into that, the first question is, who's an Indian? So typically it's if they have a CDIB card. That's your quick and easy answer. CDIB card, they're Indian. There's also 2 different federal tests that are factor tests, which means like you take the totality of the circumstances to see if they're Indian. And it has, do they have some degree of Indian blood? Not necessarily actually holding that CDIB card, but do they have a degree of Indian blood? And does the tribe hold them out to be a member? So let's get into the nitty-gritty of it. Let's see, criminal jurisdiction chart.
So can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Okay, so are you saying that Cherokee freedmen are not Indian?
For purposes For purposes of federal criminal jurisdiction, that is correct. Because in the federal circuits, you have to have some degree of Indian blood. And since freedmen do not have a degree of Indian blood, then the feds won't prosecute those cases, is my understanding.
That needs to be a separate whole deal, other, but okay, thank you for that. Okay.
For tribal jurisdiction, though, we are bound by the federal courts, but the question is, are they Indian? And so like at Seminole, we say, are you Indian? And the answer is yes or no. And then it's, well, what tribe are you? We don't get into, are you by blood? Are you not by blood? You're either Indian or you're not. So it depends on what court and how they handle that. So like with Muskogee Creek Nation, part of the element of the crime is they have to prove that they're Indian. For us, it's not an element of the crime, it's a jurisdictional question. So that can be a whole nother episode.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Okay, we're listening. Thank you, Tori.
Okay, so the criminal jurisdiction chart. Let's see if you can see that. Okay, so there are the 4 categories that I talked about. And then within that, there's two categories, the major crimes and the non-major crimes. So under the Major Crimes Act, the feds have jurisdiction over these specific crimes. And you can look it up, but it's basically the bad things like rape, murder, anything against a child, so on and so forth. And then we have the non-major crimes, so like anything else. So let's just take this, the first category. Indian commits a crime against an Indian. Well, your first question is, did it happen on Indian country? If the answer is yes, okay, now we move on to the chart. Under the Major Crimes Act, if it's one of those bad crimes like murder, rape, any of the big 15, I think is how many there are, then it's federal jurisdiction or tribal jurisdiction. Okay, so there's no double jeopardy because they're two different sovereigns. So in theory, if you had a murder, an Indian murdered another Indian on Indian country, the feds can prosecute, but also the tribe can prosecute because they're two different sovereigns. Anything short of a major crime is just tribal jurisdiction. So if an Indian commits a crime against an Indian, it's either federal or tribal. End of analysis. Until we had O'Brien. Now, the O'Brien case claims that if a non-member Indian commits a crime, then the state can prosecute. That has historically never been the case because there was a case called Duro v. Reyna where a non-member Indian committed a crime against an Indian, and they said that, well, you can't prosecute them because they're a non-member Indian. And that's what the United States Supreme Court said. And then Congress came back and said, no, 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 that's not what we meant. Any Indian in Indian country is who the tribe can prosecute. So Duro v. Reyna said, only your Indians. And Congress came back and said, no, 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 any Indian. And that's called the Duro Fix. And it's incorporated in the Indian Civil Rights Act. So pending O'Brien and how all that shakes out, this is the world we live in. Federal court or tribal court if it's an Indian on Indian crime. Questions on that? Because that's a little confusing now that we have O'Brien in there.
No, we may need to explore O'Brien just in a separate episode, even if it's short. But there was a question that I had, and I'm trying to remember what it was. The Doro fix. I don't think, and we need an episode just on the Indian Civil Rights Act because I don't think
Yes.
folks understand that either,
Yeah.
right? I'm making notes. That's why I'm like not always looking at because I'm writing. Okay, I will try not to interrupt you, but this is great.
No,
Tori,
if you have
thank
questions,
you.
please step in. And also, Lindsay Robertson is the one who made this chart, and then I've just kind of added to it and tweaked it as I've graduated law school and worlds change.
Very
Okay,
good. Thank you, Lindsay. We all know Lindsay. Most of us do.
so second category, Indian commits a crime against a non-Indian. Under the Indian Country Crimes Act, it's federal jurisdiction unless it's already been punished by the tribe. So again, there's no double jeopardy because it's two separate sovereigns, but the federal statute says if the tribe is already prosecuted, we're not going to do it. So that's federal or tribal. And if it's not a Indian Country Crimes Act, then it's tribal. So again, if the Indian is the person committing the crime, it's federal or tribal, with the caveat of O'Brien, which nobody really knows what's going on there. Okay, next category. Non-Indian commits a crime against an Indian. So for historically 100 years or more, anytime you had this category, it was only the federal court that could prosecute. There's a case called the Oliphant case, and Oliphant said that tribes cannot prosecute non-Indians, period. Well, what happened was there were a lot of domestic violence cases where you had a non-Indian perpetrator and an Indian victim. And a problem with domestic violence cases is often the victims come back, or it didn't rise to the level that the feds would take. So Congress enacted the Violence Against Women Act. And so the first Violence Against Women Act allowed the tribe to prosecute domestic violence cases. So if you had a non-Indian perpetrator and an Indian victim, and it was domestic violence, then the tribe could prosecute that person. In 2022, I think it was, they reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act, and we expanded jurisdiction. So now tribes can prosecute domestic violence cases, child cases, so crimes against children, and then crimes against law enforcement officers and court personnel. So for example, if you had a tribal police officer, an Indian police officer, and you had a non-Indian who they are in the process of arresting or whatever that is, and they assaulted and battered the law enforcement officer, the tribe can then prosecute that case.
And that
So
was under VAWA,
yes.
that is exciting. I didn't realize that was also under VAWA. Thank you.
Yeah. The 2022 reauthorization increased that jurisdiction from just domestic violence to also include law enforcement and crimes against children. Well, and then we have Castro. And so Castro concerned a non-Indian who committed a crime against an Indian. And the courts found that the state was not preempted from prosecuting. So now we have the state who can prosecute these cases. So let's say it's not a VAWA case, right? Like it's not one of those three areas. You either are going to federal court or you're going to state court under Castro. Now, if it is
For non-Indians in these circumstances, committing crimes against Indians.
Yes. But let's say that you do have a crime where it is a non-Indian perpetrator and they commit a crime that's covered under VAWA. Well, now the feds can prosecute, the state can prosecute under Castro, and the tribe can prosecute under VAWA. And it's not double jeopardy because they're three separate sovereigns. Now, most likely that's not going to happen because we typically, like if one prosecutes, the other one won't. And the tribe is also bound by the 1 year incarceration or 3 years incarceration under the Indian Civil Rights Act, which is a whole other episode we could have. So generally they will let another entity prosecute that to get more time, generally. But there's nothing prohibiting all three sovereigns from prosecuting those cases. And I know like for Seminole, we have a really great relationship with the DA's office, and under Seminole code, domestic violence is a felony. But in state court, it's a misdemeanor, unless it's like enhanced. So most of the time for the domestic violence cases, they let us take them because they can only get a misdemeanor and we can get a felony. So it's just something to keep in mind that if you're in that category, there are three different sovereigns that could prosecute. It's the most complex.
And Tori, that's what's exciting to me as an Indian person. And I don't understand, as a Cherokee Nation citizen, why they have not taken initiative to make our laws stronger to protect those that I think need more protections in our society. I don't know has UKB been able to implement any additional laws?
Yes, we have our own criminal law, but then if it's not a crime for the UKB, we've assimilated Oklahoma law. So like, let's say we didn't have a crime statute on murder. Like, let's say we didn't have that for some reason. Oh, crud, we don't have that, but the state does, so we can then pick that up. It's our assimilative crimes.
Okay. So you at least have the same as the neighboring jurisdiction or neighboring government.
Yes.
But what you're talking about, like in Seminole, where it, historically, domestic violence victims haven't been protected enough at all. And they've taken the initiative. I think it's awesome because I grew up in Seminole, so I get this, is that if they've taken that step further to say, yeah, we're going to protect what is normally women and children. So I love that. Thank you, Tori, for that example.
And it's really a great thing for Seminole Nation because word has gotten out to the public. And I literally had an attorney come in and his first words were, what a difference 50 yards makes. Here, this is a felony. Across the street, it's a misdemeanor. And I was like, welcome to sovereignty. Like, that's how that works.
Yep. Yes.
So I love it. And I think that that's really great because we do have domestic violence ties into missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. And
that's right.
A whole nother episode too. But domestic violence is a problem. I would say 90% of my cases are either drug and alcohol related or domestic violence related.
Sounds par for course, just anecdotally. Yes. Yep. And that's sad. But and Tori, we are going to work on MMIW here at Cherokee 411. Yeah. Okay. And I'll be talking about that with you behind the scenes because I have some ideas on how we can
Okay.
all work together for that. So, okay,
Love
I interrupted you, and we were on number 2, non-Indian on Indian, and we just talked about the Oliphant case and Castro Huerta.
Mhm. So that
Okay,
concludes non-Indian on Indian. So remember, if it's a VAWA case, all three. If it's not VAWA, then it's either federal or state. Okay, so
okay,
the last category, the most simple category, is a non-Indian commits a crime against a non-Indian. That is only state jurisdiction. So let's say you're at the casino, which, pro tip, every casino is going to be on Indian country in Oklahoma, and you have two non-Indians engaged in a fist fight. Only the state prosecutes. So the first question is it Indian country? So if your answer is yes, then you go to this pretty little chart. So then your question is, okay, well, what's the Indian status of the perpetrator? Well, are they Indian or are they non-Indian? So you go to whichever one that is. Then it's, is the victim Indian or non-Indian? And then you go to wherever that one is. The only caveat I would have here is for victimless crimes. So, like, let's say possession of drug paraphernalia, right? Like, that's not a victim crime. So what we typically do is we say who the society is. So, like, if you drop paraphernalia at the casino, well, the victims there are the casino patrons, and it's owned by the tribe. So we're going to say that the victim here is the tribe itself, the society.
okay.
Um, so victimless crimes can kind of vary. It just depends on like what the officer, like which officer's investigating it, and then where they want to take it. So like if we had in the reservation, we just had someone out on the street, they're non-Indian, they drop a bag of meth, state officer sees them, state's gonna pick that up. Versus if it's in the casino, in theory, this casino light horse or law enforcement agency would be the one to do that. And they would say that the victim is the tribe. Well, wait, hold on. That wouldn't be VAWA. So that was a bad example. So that would go state. Drug cases go state or federal if they meet the trafficking requirements and all that jazz. So drug dropping is a bad example. Sorry.
No, it's okay. But I have a question. So if it's a victim or if it's non-Indian on non-Indian, more than likely it's the arresting or folks that'll secure those folks at the casino. Like let's say the fight between two non-Indians inside a casino is either going to be casino security followed up by the tribal police.
Right.
So tribal law enforcement. Does it matter if the tribal law enforcement has a pact or agreement with the local police who would have the
So
jurisdiction? How does it?
the
Because not
tribe
everybody cooperates with this.
So the tribe doesn't have criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians. So if I am a tribal police officer and there are two non-Indians engaged in a fight, I don't have criminal jurisdiction over them. So I would have to call the state to come and to take care of those individuals. So that's why cross steps are important, is because then as the state officer, because remember, I switched my hat. I had on my tribal hat. Oh, you're a non-Indian. Let me put my state hat on. Okay, now I'm a state officer and now I can arrest. If you don't have a cross-step agreement, then under the US v. Cooley case, the tribal officer can detain. So I'm a tribal officer. I see two non-Indians engaged in a fight. You come with me. I'm detaining you, and you're going to sit here until a state officer comes and handles this.
I should have asked you before I asked this question, but I've heard rumors in the community that the Cherokee Nation has bullied UKB. You may not want to speak to it today, and that's okay. But like when I say bully, like the cross deputization agreements is what I'm talking about. Like
Mhm.
you need to secure cross deputization agreements because the Department of Interior said we have the same jurisdiction. And I've understand that after agreements were secured, Cherokee Nation went in and had them pulled by threatening money. Is that something you can speak to today for a moment, or do you want to
That
hold
is
off comment?
That's a rumor I've heard a lot. I do know that we have tried to get a cross-step agreement on the Tahlequah City agenda 3 times, and each time that was pulled. So, as to why, I'm not entirely sure, but we all have speculations, and it is not a surprise that every time UKB does try to get something, that Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma comes in and makes a fuss about it.
I'm sure there's a
Very
big
frustrating.
check, picture, donation at the same time. I will tell you, I'm not shy about saying I support law enforcement and I support law and order. I mean, we got to have governance. We need to have place. People need to know that they're safe when they go around the Cherokee Nation, especially if we want, or UKB, the tribes, they have to feel safe if we're going to have economic development and if we're going to
Absolutely.
have future. And so for this to be happening is frustrating to me because I want to know that law enforcement, whether they work for UKB or whether they work for Cherokee Nation, are protected and safe and can make arrests that make our community safer. I just want to go on record saying that, Tori. I'll
Well,
say hopefully that.
as someone
Go
who
ahead,
works
please.
closely with several law enforcement agencies, I mean, there is kind of a brotherhood that is there because it is a dangerous job. I've had several officers tell me like they would much rather show up to a domestic than do a traffic stop because you don't know who you're pulling over in a traffic stop and whether they're
Yes.
armed and what the situation is there. At least with a domestic, like you're prepped in your mind and you know this could be a dangerous thing. So, like, being a law enforcement officer every day is a dangerous job. Like, you might not be going home that evening, unfortunately. So, there's always been this kind of brotherhood and support system there. And it makes me really sad because, like, not only do we have this law enforcement brotherhood, we're also all Cherokee. And rather than tearing each other down, we should be helping each other and building up our communities. We should have the safest 14 counties in the state of Oklahoma. We have multiple law enforcement agencies. We have 2 tribes. We have so many resources that come into our 14 counties. There's no reason our 14 counties should not be the most successful 14 counties in the state of Oklahoma.
Amen, Tori. Amen. I agree. I agree. Well, I got us off track. Sorry.
No, you're
So
fine.
I know we were talking about jurisdiction and how that's decided at when crimes are happening or alleged crimes are happening. So you've covered 1 and 2, or did we do 2, or are we on the next? Is there another
We've
part of it?
we've done
I was
all of
trying to
them.
keep
So
notes. Okay.
let's recap. I got us mixed up when it came to victimless crimes. Let's just
Okay.
remember the outline. First question is it Indian country? Okay. If the
Okay.
answer is yes, then you go to the next question, which is what is the Indian status of the perpetrator? Are they Indian? Are they non-Indian? Third question, who's the victim? And if it's a victimless crime, then generally, if it's a non-Indian, it's going to be state, and generally, if it's an Indian, it's going to be tribal. That's the better way to put that.
Okay.
So those are
Very
your 3
good.
questions you ask. So 1, is it Indian country? 2, sorry. 2 is what's the Indian status of the perpetrator? 3, what's the Indian status of the victim? And you go to your
Okay.
chart, and there's your answer.
Okay. Very good. Well, this is a lot to
Thanks for having me.
digest. Yeah, and there's going to be more episodes that come out of this. So Tori, you're stuck with this. Um, we
That's
we're
fine.
going
I
to
love
use
it.
the content of your slide or the chart. We may pretty it up or make it look bigger and kind of explain
You
some of
can
the
pretty it.
acronyms for people, and we'll share that back with you. And then yeah, I'm going to look at my notes. I'll see what other episodes we'll try to do 1 or 2 a week if you have time, as you have time. Um, Anything else you want to share with us, Tori, before we close today?
Indian law is not that complex. You just have to know what questions to ask and in what order. So, criminal jurisdiction isn't that hard. Remember your 3 questions, go to your chart, there's your answer.
I love it. Thank you for demystifying the whole thing for us, because I know mainstream media and our tribal governance, I mean, God love us, but we just haven't seemed to stop to explain this. I think it's important. The other thing I'd leave with our Cherokee Nation and UKB citizens is know your laws, know your
Yes.
tribal laws, make time to go to your government website. I know UKB is doing a lot to try to put theirs online. God love us at Cherokee Nation. We had it online. It's still online, but sometimes it's a little bit harder to figure out the amendments and what applies. So, but we'll get there.
We
Wado,
will.
everyone. Thank you again. Tori, thanks for being with us today. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Join the conversation. Discover stories and insights that matter to you. Subscribe to Cherokee 411 with Kara and stay connected with independent media, real, relevant, and unfiltered.